I'm going to start this off with a bold statement. A lot of the web is boring. I'm going to immediately climb down from that, though, however, because I don't want to riot. For the most part, that's absolutely fine. For a lot of companies, a lot of people, a lot of businesses and projects, that makes the most sense. You want to be consistent with how people expect to use the web and not have any unexpected surprises or anything like that. But what I worry about, however, is that developers might do boring because creative and fun seems hard, or they don't know how to do creative and fun, and just go for boring out of default. First, a bit of admin. These slides are online if you want to follow along or get them after the fact. I'll post them on various socials after the talk too. Brief content warning, there are animated demos, videos, stuff like that don't have too much dramatic movement or flashing or anything like that, but just be aware of it. There's no getting around the fact that I'm showing visual stuff. So there's demos, videos, illustrations, stuff like this. I'll describe it where I can to make it accessible to everyone. This talk does have some code, but not a lot. There's blog posts with most of them that you can really dig your teeth into if you want to see that code. And finally, keep your hands and feet inside the conference talk at all times. So this is basically what I'm here to show you. This is my website, alistairshepard.uk. It has a few creative features that, with the web platform, take surprisingly little to implement, but do a lot to make the website quite interesting. This video is demonstrating a few of those, and the things I'm going to talk about today. So the first of that is parallax using CSS scroll-driven animations. We also have a live color theming using custom properties, and generative SVG section dividers. This will all make sense soon. So first, a little bit of background on the ideas and the background of my website. So the design of these slides and of my website might be familiar to a lot of people, based on the video game Firewatch. Anyone know Firewatch? A few people. I really enjoyed the game, but it was the promotional material, posters like this, that really caught my attention. Kind of bright layered landscapes with single-tone color schemes of somewhere far off in the Rockies-ish. I really love mountains. I really love nature and the outdoors, so I thought this was stunning. And when I put common web designs aside and thought about what I could really do, I couldn't get this sort of thing out of my head. A lot of websites live within a kind of static, timeless cage. You visit them, they're always the same. That's just what the website is. But I wanted to have a website that reached out and interacted a little bit with the environment or context it was viewed in. It wasn't always the same. This was a previous version of my site. It had a 24-hour-long background video that I paid a silly amount of money for a stock photo website from. But that is a lot of work, energy, and bandwidth that was really completely unnecessary. But the idea of having something related to the time really stuck with me. So a few years ago, I was building a new personal site, wanted to take some of these ideas into account, have a theme of nature and mountains, inspired by Firewatch perhaps, and changing with something environmental or contextual. So I used the unique skills, the talents that I have to show what I can do by asking my sister to help me. She's an artist. Creative code I can do, art absolutely not. I can't draw for my life. So I commissioned this. This is near where I grew up in Highlands, Scotland. It's in the Firewatch style, layered landscape. And yeah, it's kind of layered, single-tone landscape of some mountains and forest. And this is the basis of my website and slides. And in fact, because I have no new creative ideas, this is my lanyard for today. It's the exact same style, just with Lego. So I use this design absolutely everywhere. So I'm starting our first topic today on simple parallax using scroll-driven animations, the Scroll-Driven Animations API. So I wanted to take that landscape and make it more dynamic and interactive, like the user was involved. Parallax felt like a natural way to do that. In a weird kind of way, though, when you start to think about parallax in this style, it kind of, the user is like sinking into the ground or squatting. It's a bit odd, but it does produce a really nice effect. First, a brief recap on what parallax is. It's basically you wanting to add depth to a page, so as the user scrolls, elements of the page scroll at a different speed. So you can have elements that are moving faster appear in the foreground, elements are moving slower appearing in the background. It was used a huge amount. It was the in thing 5 to 10 years ago, less common now. Before we get into how to implement it, I really should address the parallaxed elephant in the room. And yes, I made this demo just for that joke. When I mention my website has parallax, I get the response, really? Parallax? That's so 2015. And to a certain extent, they have a point. Well, it can be overused, implemented quite poorly. Many implementations don't consider accessibility or performance as much as they really should. But where it does make sense, enhances the page, is implemented well, it can be a really nice effect. Like many things, if it's overused or done badly, it can be a bit bad or tacky. There are a few different ways of implementing parallax on the web, and as a fun fact, this talk has had basically all of them at one point or another. Previously, the best, but also most tricky, was using CSS transforms with the 3D transforms with the CSS perspective property. It has worked in browsers for decades, or probably a decade-ish, and is quite simple, but where you've got complex elements like large complex SVGs, or you want more flexibility, it can be a bit limiting. There's a post there if you want to check it out. If you've got a simple parallax effect that you want to implement, then the Chrome developer blog has a great post about that. Previously, if that approach didn't work for you, you'd had to go straight for JavaScript. So custom JavaScript, there's loads of libraries out there, but you can build something reasonably performant and lightweight with a little JavaScript and CSS custom properties and the calc function. I wrote a post about that you can look at there, but there is a better option now, and that is scroll-driven animations, which is a new feature within browsers that allows animations, the traditional CSS and JavaScript animations we've used loads, to progress with the scroll position. This is perfect for parallax implementation, as it doesn't have the same limitations of the perspective method, but still uses a simple native API and performs great. So scroll-linked animations and transitions are a very common pattern on the web and traditionally require JavaScript to implement or trigger. Over the past few years, the CSS working group and browser maintainers have been working on the new scroll-driven animation API. This is a demo of a few demos that use that. This API allows us to create CSS or JavaScript animations that are linked to the scroll position easily natively, and they all run faster because where they're supported, they're running on the GPU compositor rather than on the main thread in JavaScript land. So, this is a video. All of these demos are using CSS implementation of the scroll-linked animation API, not a line of JavaScript on any of these demos. Big thank you to Brams and Jay for allowing me to use their demos here. Okay, so let's dig into how we can actually implement this. So I'm going to use it with the CSS API because CSS is amazing. I'm starting with the keyframes for the animation for this effect. These work the same as just a normal CSS animation. You set the keyframes of the animation. Here we're starting at no translation with a transform property. And then the animation is going to a calculation that multiplies 100 VH, as in the full viewport height, with a offset custom property. We'll get onto that in a second. And in a layer CSS rule, we then specify an animation using those keyframes. So far, pretty normal for CSS animations. But instead of letting the animation run on the page load, we instead use the animation timeline property to link that animation progress with the scroll progress. We do that with the scroll function, with parameters to choose the direction, in this case block. For English languages, that's up and down. And the scroller to use, so root here, is the main document. And by default, that animation will run, fill the entirety of the scroll of the page. So 0% is the very top of the page, 100% is the very bottom of the page. Some cases, that's what you want. Think like a reading progress indicator at the top of a page. But in this case, that would mean that the length of the page would affect the speed of the animation. So instead, we're limiting it to start at 100 VH at the very top of the page, and for the animation to finish at 100 VH after the first viewport. So it's only that top section that the animation runs. And finally, user prefers reduce motion media query to disable the animation for users that need it for accessibility reasons, who may suffer from motion-induced nausea. Just helps make it a pleasant experience for all. Now onto that offset property with a bit of what I like to call as custom property magic. This is the HTML for that landscape. Bunch of divs. Each one has a layer of the landscape, and each one has a unique value for that offset custom property. And this is one of the things that I love most about custom properties, in that all of these layers, they all have the exact same CSS class. You've seen all of the CSS for this demo. All of these layers share it. Using that offset custom property, it acts almost like a input parameter to the CSS. So we can have that same CSS perform differently depending on that parameter. So here, that property affects how quickly the element moves on scroll compared to the scroll position. So an offset of 1 moves at the same speed, times by 100 VH is 100 VH. 0 doesn't move at all, times by 0. 0.6 moves at 60% of the scroll speed. So I've manually set these to look natural for this landscape. And there we go, when the slide changes. There we go. Put that together and we have a basic parallax effect using only CSS and HTML, no JavaScript at all. The key points here, using scroll-driven animations to power the animation itself, and a little bit of custom properties, that offset property to change how much each layer scrolls within the animation. This video here showing parallax effect with layers of the landscape as they go further back, moving at a slower speed on scroll. So scroll-driven animations are a relatively new API. I should have put can I use up here as referenced earlier. Currently the spec is at working draft, and they're only implemented by default in Chromium-based browsers. It's version 115, which came out in July this year. It is in Firefox behind a flag. Both the Safari and Firefox development teams are pretty keen on this API though. They both expressed support for it, so hopefully we'll see this relatively soon. In the meantime, however, there is a polyfill that works fantastically. You can drop it on the page. It doesn't perform quite as well because it's patching, it's polyfilling the functionality within JavaScript, but it means you can start using scroll animations to a certain degree right now in production in all browsers. There's a lot more could explore with this, including animations that run when an element enters or leaves the viewport. So that's view timelines that are also really amazing and can be combined with scroll timelines to produce really cool effects. It's also not just limited to CSS. There is a JavaScript API that integrates with this really nicely with the Web Animations API. I don't yet have any, I mentioned a blog post earlier, I don't yet have a blog post on this, you're getting an exclusive. But this resource by Brammer, scroll-driven animations.style, has some great examples on how to implement it, some demos, stuff like that. Okay, so next I'm going to cover themes and time syncing animated color changing. So wanted this landscape to be not be fixed and static, as I mentioned earlier, to have some sort of context, environmental link there. Changing over the course of a day with time seemed like a great way of doing that. This concept has actually been one I've kind of revisited time and time again. One of my first coding projects actually was a batch script changing the wallpaper on my computer to different images throughout the day. Since then, I've regularly had wallpaper or phone backgrounds along those lines. So felt it was about time I did it on my website too. So going back to that Firewatch image, it's a great example of how all that's needed to give an impression of time changing is the colors used. So this image here, split up into 3 different sections. Blues feels kind of like nightimey, early morning. The kind of bright oranges in the center feel like kind of middle of the day, and the browns and darker yellows feels like kind of sunset, evening time. So if we used the same concept with my landscape to change the colors, we could give the impression of the time changing. And as we can transition between colors on the web, we could have a unique color for every moment of the day. Synchronizing that with the user's current time would be a cool effect. So you land on the website and it's the time you're at. So let's dive in. But first, we need to set up those colors as a system of custom properties. So I mentioned custom properties briefly earlier. I love them. I use them more than I probably should, to be honest. In modern browsers, they make color schemes and theming in particular easier than ever and super, super simple. So I can have my site colors, each with a key name declared in the HTML element, and use them wherever they're needed with the var function. And depending on the theming method, I could update those color variables at the top in CSS, in HTML, or in JavaScript, and CSS will handle the rest, and the browser will handle the rest for us. So here's a video updating those color variables on a button click. It's literally just event listener on a button, and then when it does it, it uses style.setProperty to update the custom property. So we've got basic theme system using custom properties, but how do we animate those? CSS animations or transitions was my first thought, maybe a 24-hour animation with color values within the keyframes. Unfortunately, you hit an early stumbling block there there's no easy way of controlling the start point of an animation. How do we say we want to start at 60% of the way through an animation? There's no way of doing that. So that leaves us with a JS implementation. I'm going to briefly break down the method of doing that, not getting into the code. Again, if you want to dig your teeth into that, you can go look at the blog post. It ends up being mostly a bit of maths and JS object manipulation, so it's not particularly fun stuff. One is to have an animation loop. Depending on the speed, that might be every frame with request animation frame, or every few seconds with set timeout. Set interval, sorry. 2, get the progress through the animation. So 24-hour animation, that's through the day. Shorter animation is just how far through the minute, for example, for 60 seconds. 3 would be to get the previous and next color states. So if the day theme is at 12 p.m. and the sunset theme is at 6 p.m. and it's 2, then we're 33% of the way from one to the other. And with that progress percentage, for each color, we can get an intermediate color. So that's it's a concept called linear interpolation, which is a way of giving 2 values, in this case 2 colors, a progress value, and it'll work out the value at 33% between those 2 points. And finally, we update those theme custom properties. And with that, we have an animation between the color schemes. This video is going through blues to mean kind of night or morning, pinks, oranges, and yellows to kind of represent sunset. This is 20 seconds, but it could be any scale just by changing how frequently it updates. JavaScript does a bit of maths to work out those colors, but it's intentionally ignorant of the page structure. CSS and custom properties handle those, which elements are which color, which is great because it leaves CSS to do what it does best and JavaScript to do what it does best. So that looked pretty good, but I don't know if you noticed there, but it might be the color of the projector, but the transition between the colors kind of goes through gray. It goes a bit muddy in between. It wasn't really quite what I'd hoped. And that is because linear interpolation works out the middle value for each parameter depending on the color format. So RGB, it gets the average red, the average green, and the average blue, which means it goes through a neutral gray. There are other color formats which express colors in different ways, however, and they interpolate differently, resulting in different effects depending on which one you use. This is the exact same color in 5 different formats. So HSL in the middle there is an alternate way of expressing RGB. Lab and LCH at the bottom are a different color scheme entirely that express colors that RGB can't. I could write an entire talk about color schemes and color formats and color spaces. I'm not going to get into it, but the main point is that because they express colors in different ways, when you interpolate them, they produce different effects. So with that new knowledge I've got of color formats, I can clearly switch everything to use HSL and get a better effect, right? Maybe not. You can see the right moments in there, but that isn't quite the effect I was going for. It's more like there's kind of a rave or a disco going on there. That's because HSL's first parameter is hue. So interpolation goes around the edge of the color wheel through all of the intermediate other hues before it gets to the color you're wanting. And it's not just HSL. All of those color formats end up interpolating and animating differently. So RGB in the top left is what we saw. It kind of goes through kind of muddy grays. Are they animating? No, they are animating. Goes through grays a bit when it goes between each one. Lab in the top right, it's what I use on my website. It's a bit more vibrant, how it expresses colors, kind of goes through, keeps the vibrancy up. HSL, we've seen, and LCH in the bottom right is a different way of expressing lab, but has H, the hue parameter on the end, which again means it goes through some weird colors in between. So as before, there are some further things we can do with that. The color form, space and format in particular really affects how colors animate and transition. And there are loads more out there than those 4 which you've seen that would affect things. So whenever you're transitioning or animating colors on the web, it can be really useful to think about what format, what space you're doing it in to provide a different or better effect. Like there's different animation timing functions like linear, ease in, out, all sorts of different functions there. You could have a different interpolation function instead of linear interpolation for a different effect. So what I've gone through there, it's based on a blog post. Again, this is all public and all available on my website too, so you can check that out for the code samples and the actual code that's being used and more details there. So onto the SVG mounted dividers. If you're keen-eyed, okay, I think I haven't used high enough color contrast. They are meant to be at the bottom of the screen. I can see them here, but I don't know, you can maybe just about make them out, but they're at the bottom there. So when making my site, I really like utilizing color schemes to alternate the background colors of sections. That's a pretty common practice in web design. Breaks up the page into more manageable chunks, allows you to more easily digest the information there. But you just do that and you end up with straight lines, which works for some site. It doesn't work for this one. It kind of totally changes the tone as you go scroll beyond the top of the page there. So I wanted to make a divider that fit in more with the mountain theme of my site. So this was a quick divide I did in a vector editor. It looks okay, but when you see it twice on the same page there, it does look a bit weird because it's kind of symmetrical in a kind of way. It looks a bit duplicated. So I wanted each one to be unique, but not have to make more every time I publish a new blog post, change the structure of my page, anything like this. So I needed a way to generate them with code. This, in my keenness, I went straight for my first ideas. This demo uses math.random and just kind of randomly moves lines up and down. And it's less like a mountain ridge and more like a bed of nails, to be honest. It's not particularly useful. I played around with it, but nothing useful came out of that. So after that resounding success, I actually did some research, God forbid, and slowed down and thought about what I was doing. So I was looking for a simple and fast algorithm I could implement myself in JavaScript, ideally. And most of what I found actually came from game development as terrain generation algorithms. And particularly, there's this one called midpoint displacement, which is extremely quick, not often used in games anymore, but just because it's fairly rudimentary, but it's perfect for my purposes. How it works is you take a line across the screen, you take a middle point, and then you move it randomly up or down. Then for each segment you've created, you take a middle point and you move it up and down randomly. Each time, and you keep going with that until you've got the fidelity you want. But each time you take that middle point and move it randomly, you randomize it slightly less, so it gets more and more kind of fine detail. And this looks, a lot more like a mountain or hill ridge I was looking for. So it generates in a few milliseconds in JavaScript. There's a nice small SVG I can use between each section. As it's SVG, can style it with CSS, can use my custom properties with it, can even insert it into a CSS clip path, or use it with any other SVG capabilities, so it's super flexible. And once again, we're at the next step screen. With a bit of JS and SVG, we've got a nice effect separating sections with that mountain ridge. I've gone for terrain generation here, but using different SVG commands, different CSS effects, different generation functions, you could have all sorts of stuff. There are other ways of generating random numbers like simplex or Perlin noise, which would give different effects here. I didn't use them because I wanted something super fast. Even at the state of this, it runs on my website. It generates about 1,000 every time I save my website, and it rebuilds. Takes 100 milliseconds or so it's not an issue. But if you're using something more complex, then that might be more of a pain. As I suggested there, as it's SVG, you can generate it anywhere, really. It's code, it's markup. So at first I used client-side JavaScript, but you could do it. I moved it to my static site generator, generate them in advance, do it server-side, any language, any place you'd like to. Once again, I've done a blog post on this. That includes full code for the generation algorithm, if that's of interest, for the points and for the SVG path. Okay, so that was a bit of a rush through a few different things. I hope I've shown some of the really nice, cool stuff and creative stuff we can do with modern CSS and JavaScript by stringing a few fairly simple pieces together. I've got a few things to mention before we wrap up. You're probably sick of me putting video demos up on here, so this is the last one, I promise. It's just showing everything that we've seen. We've got a parallax effect at the top there. We've got some buttons to change the theme. The color scheme is animating slowly, and some generative SVG dividers at the bottom there. I've got some bad news for you all, I'm afraid. I'm going to give you some homework. So the first is to go and look for web inspiration. You can find it anywhere. Check out other industries, pop your head in, see what gets the ideas flowing. Video games and digital art inspired my website quite a bit, but I previously found creative ideas and inspiration in my houseplants, in a theatre production, even in a used caravan dealer, which was a bit of an odd conversation when I came back from spacing out for a few minutes. The web platform has so many fantastic features, and building cool creative websites is easier than it has ever been. And over the next decade, with some of the new things coming out and some of the new things proposed, it's only going to keep on getting easier and keep on getting better. So take some of what I've mentioned, some of what some of the other speakers today have mentioned, anything you've seen anywhere that you want to have a play with, go have a play with, see what you can make browsers do. Finally, if you're able to, go and make fun websites. If you do, please show them, share them off, share them publicly, or if you can't, at least just to me. I love seeing the cool stuff we can do with the web. Thank you.